Alright, y'all, what's up? So this is going to be volume 2 of the Vlad the Impaler series, or Vlad Dracul, or Vlad Dracula series. And this is going to be an investigation into the origins of Vlad the Impaler, as well as his ancestry as well. And of course, we're going to investigate whether or not Vlad the Impaler was a so-called black man. So let's take a look at this description real quick of Vlad. And this is one of the only real accurate descriptions that I could find of what Vlad looked like. So let's just take a look at this real quick. I'm gonna start from the top. So of course it says Prince Vlad III, or Vlad Dracula, Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler. Of course he was called Vlad the Impaler because impaling was his favorite form of capital punishment. So best known for impaling, decapitating, gouging out eyes, skinning alive, boiling, dismembering, and physically disfiguring 40,000 to 100,000 people. So yeah, Vlad was a negro that was out there. He's pretty out there with his torture mechanisms. So as we can see, born 1431 in the fortress of Sighisoara, Romania. Sighisoara is a province in Transylvania, if I'm not mistaken. So family, his father, Vlad Dracul, was made Prince of Wallachia, one of the 3 Romanian provinces, after murdering the ruling prince in 1437. In 1442, his father gave Vlad and his brother Radu as hostages to the Turks to prove his loyalty. Father murdered in 1447, younger brother Radu successfully led an army against him in 1462 and stole Vlad's kingdom. Vlad's first wife committed suicide as Radu's army approached. He later married a member of the Hungarian royal family. So now let's look at this physical description here, because this is going to tell us a lot about what Vlad truly looked like. So now let's read. So we can see here it says, swarthy with long, dark braided hair, a regal nose and a regal nose that hung over his long mustache. Alright, so now as we can see here, the term swarthy is used here to describe Vlad's skin complexion. So now for those of you who may be subscribed to the channel, or for those of you who are viewing the channel and who may not have seen the previous series that I did on the Black Vikings, which you guys should go and check out, by the way. I did an investigation, a very brief investigation into what this term swarthy meant. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, the term swarthy is just basically a synonym for a quote-unquote dark-skinned person, or somebody who has very, very dark skin complexion, or a dark skin hue. Okay, so but unfortunately you have a lot of people on the internet, as well as scholars, relatively modern scholars, who try and redefine this term swarthy to mean somebody who has like a tan colored complexion, or somebody who's, you know, slightly darker than the average so-called Caucasian, who has, of course, pale skin, right? But circa about like the 13th or the 14th century on down, even into the 1800s, as I'm about to prove in a little bit, the term swarthy really was just a term that meant somebody who was either very, very dark brownish colored in terms of their complexion, or somebody who was just outright dark skinned. Okay, like somebody like a Wesley Snipes. Okay, so that's what this term swarthy meant. But nowadays, once again, it means something totally different, and that's true amongst various words today. Various words today mean something totally different than what they meant back during the medieval time period, and even antiquity, right? Relative antiquity, and then even back during the ancient world. There are various words and phrases that mean something totally different today than they did back then in those times. So swarthy is definitely one of those words. So we're going to do a very extensive investigation into the term swarthy in a minute. As we can see, he's also described as having dark braided hair. Now when you look up a depiction of Vlad the Impaler, he don't look like somebody who has quote unquote braided hair. He looks like a so-called, of course, a Caucasian with long flowing curly-ish hair. Okay, like wavy hair, if you will. So, but in this description, he's described as having braided hair. Now, of course, the braid hairstyle is a hairstyle that is mainly worn by black people today, and that's a hairstyle that black people have been associated with going all the way back to the ancient world. Like I think around 3,500 BC is how far the braiding hairstyle goes back to, and of course, the braiding hairstyle originated with certain tribes in Africa. Okay, so you can go ahead and you can look that up, but once again, as it states here, Vlad the Impaler had quote unquote braided hair. All right. So now let's just look at what the term swarthy means real quick, so that we can clarify exactly what that term is meant to entail. All right. So now we're on the Oxford Dictionary. So as we can see, swarthy, especially of a person or their face having dark skin. All right. So let's look at the word origin. So late 16th century, alteration of obsolete swarthy from Old English swart. So now we're going to see what that term swart means. Okay, so of Germanic origin related to Dutch zwart and German schwarz. So we're also going to see what this term schwarz means as well a little bit later. So now let's move on to another definition of the term swarthy. So now we're on the Cambridge Dictionary. Of course, it says swarthy of a person of their skin dark, a swarthy face, complexion, swarthy fisherman. All right, so now down here we see compare black as an adjective for people. So as we can see here, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, black can be used as a substitute word for swarthy. Okay, used as an adjective to describe people. That's what this is saying right here. So as we can see black, adjective or descriptive word to describe a person. So swarthy, in other words, is a word that means a black person, right? Or black people, as it states right here. All right, so just before I move on, for the people out there who state that swarthy just means tan or slightly darker than an average so-called Caucasian, I don't know how true that is. I really don't, because as we've just seen so far, and as we're about to see in a minute, swarthy is a word that has always been associated with somebody who has a very, very noticeable skin complexion that's very, very dark. Yep. So swarthy, that's a term that, as we've seen so far from two very, very reputable sources, Cambridge and Oxford, and their dictionaries. It's a term that means somebody who's very, very dark skinned, not somebody who's tan. Someone who's very dark skinned, what we would call today a black person, as it even states down here, black adjective people. But you know what, let's move on. All right, so now we're on the Merriam-Webster dictionary. So of course, swarthy used as an adjective. Definition of swarthy: of a dark color, complexion, or cast. All right, so now let's see some synonyms for swarthy. So synonyms: black. All right, so you have a lot of people out there who state that swarthy doesn't even mean quote unquote black, or that it doesn't entail somebody who's quote unquote black. But as we can see here, a synonym for swarthy is in fact black. Okay. So and then of course we have other synonyms like brunette. Now this term brunette is something that I'll expound upon later in later series probably. But the term brunette, as we know today, means somebody who has dark hair, like dark brown hair. That's what the term brunette means today. But once again, words and meanings of words today have a completely different definition and connotation behind them than they did back during quote unquote medieval times or even ancient times. Okay? And even relatively modern times. So, but we're going to see that in a minute. So, but once again, synonyms are black, brunette. Brunette was a term, for those of you who don't know, that also meant somebody who had very, very dark complexion, or very dark brown complexion as well. But once again, that's going to be something else for another day. Then, of course, we see dark, swart. Swart is just another alteration of swarthy. All right, so let's move on. All right, so now let's look at what etymologyonline.com states about what the term swarthy means. So as we can see, swarthy, dark colored, especially of skin, 1580s. Unexplained alteration of swarthy, 1570s, from swart, E, right, or swart plus Y, which is swarthy, related swarthiness. So now let's look at the term swart real quick. So swart, from Old English swart, which means quite literally black, dark, of night. Clouds also figurative. Okay, so this Old English word that we saw earlier, swart, from I think the Oxford Dictionary, the word swart literally means black. That's literally what the term swart means, and swart is one of the antecedent words of swarthy, and then even swart, as we can see right here. Okay, so now let's read some other words that this has listed on here. So, source of Old Frisian, Old Saxon, Middle Dutch, swart, Dutch, zwart, Old Norse, svarter, German, schwarz. We're going to look at schwarz in a minute. Gothic, swarts, dark colored, black, from pi root, swardo, dirty, black, dark, source of sorted. All right, so the true Germanic word surviving in the continental languages, but displaced in English by black. So in other words, this term swart, which as we've seen means black, dark, something that entails a dark color or dark complexion per se, was displaced or was replaced by the English word black. So now when we use the term black today to describe somebody, who are we talking about? Right? What group of people do we normally associate with that term black? Right? So, and then of course it goes on to say of skin color of persons from later 14th century or from late 14th century. So that's like the late 1300s. All right. So, but once again, it's as it states right here, the word swart or swarthy was displaced by black. So in other words, this word right here, swart, at one point in time was like saying what we would call today black, right? So when you call somebody swart back during, as this states right here, the late 14th century or the late 1300s, but really even beyond that, or even beyond that time period, whenever you refer to somebody as swart or swarthy, that was the equivalent of what we would call today, or if we were to use the term today, black, to describe somebody, that term would be the equivalent of what we use the term black today for somebody's skin complexion. Okay, so when we call somebody a black person today, obviously that entails that they're quote unquote African American or whatever you want to call it. And so it was the same thing back in this time period, but the term swart was used instead of black. All right, so now let's just move on. So now this is the German word that I referenced earlier. So now let's just read this definition real quick. So also Schwarzer, or Svarters. Svarters, I don't know what the hell that says, but Svarters are black person, somewhat derogatory. 1961, Yiddish from Swartz, black, see Swarthy. So now why the hell does it state right here that this term Swartz or Svartizer, which is just another term for black person, a derogatory term for a black person, comes from a Yiddish word Svartz, which means black, and then it says see Swarthy. So it's obvious that this term swarthy is congruent with this derogatory term that was mainly used for black people. Okay? So once again, this should prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the term swarthy is was a term that was used to describe a black person, or what we would call today a black person. All right, for the people out there who state otherwise, or who try to alterate the definition of the term swarthy, or who try to use the modern day definition of the term swarthy, which entails somebody who is like a slightly darker skin complexion than a regular Caucasian person. Like, you know what? Let me pull up an example real quick. All right, so this is what a person who would be described as quote unquote swarthy today looks like according to today's standards, according to today's conventional standards of what a quote unquote swarthy person is. And as we can see, this is a quote unquote Caucasian who has slightly brown, orangish tinge type skin, right? He's obviously darker than your average what they call quote unquote Nordic type Caucasian, or somebody who has very, very pale skin, maybe blue eyes, blonde hair, whatever. So, but as we can see, this person right here is quote unquote darker. He's darker than a lot of other Caucasians, but of course he's not what we would describe as quote unquote swarthy according to the etymological definition of what swarthy meant back during the medieval time period, and even relatively ancient times as well. And you know what? Even modern times, even during the, as I referenced earlier, during the 1800s, the term swarthy was basically just a word that was a synonym for a black person. Okay, so now I'm just gonna go to a couple of 19th century or 1800s dictionary definitions of what the term swarthy meant back then. All right, so now this is a dictionary from the late 1800s, around 1882, if I'm not mistaken. So now let's read what this definition states right here about what the term swarthy meant back during this time period. So as we can see, swarthy, adjective, dark of complexion, black, dusky, tawny. So now I went over this term dusky in my other series as well. Once again, you guys should go check out the Black Viking series. I'm probably gonna have the link to that in the description, or you guys can just go to the channel and find those videos readily available. But anyway, but yeah, I went over this term dusky as well, and the term dusky basically just means the same as swarthy, something that is very, very dark, or even somebody that's very, very dark skinned. Okay, and then tawny is like tawny would mean somebody who's of a what we would call quote unquote brownish skin complexion. Okay, so that's basically what tawny means, but I'll go over these two words later on. So, but when we read down here, I don't know how well you guys can see that, but it even gives an example of what a swarthy person looks like. So now let's read this real quick. So the swarthy Africans, I believe that says complexion, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, so even right here, it gives the definition of what a quote unquote swarthy person would look like. A swarthy African, right? Somebody, of course, who is of what we would call quote unquote African or African American descent is an example of what the term swarthy means. All right. And then even when we read down, it says right here, though in the torrid climates the common color is black or swarthy. So black and swarthy are used interchangeably in this sentence right here. Okay, so black, swarthy, those two words are congruent with one another. Those two words basically mean the same thing. Okay, so now let's look at yet another dictionary definition from the 1800s as well of what the term swarthy meant. So this is the Noah Webster 1828 dictionary website. So now let's read what the Noah Webster dictionary has to say. And once again, this is a dictionary from 1820. Okay, so the early 1800s, but let's read. So swarthy, adjective, see swart, being of a dark hue or dusky complexion, tawny. So once again, dusky, tawny, those two basically mean just like dark brown or very, very dark colored. Okay. So in warm climates, the complexion of man or of men is universally swarthy or black. Once again, swarthy, black being used as interchangeable terms here in this sentence. So as we can see, the Moors, right? So the Moors are definitely going to be a people that I reference because it's very, very important that our people not only have an understanding of who the Moors were, but of what this term Moor actually was meant to entail, right, or imply. Because you have a lot of people who try and state that a Moor is just like a quote-unquote North African Berber and all that. But I'm sure most of them don't even know that, for number one, the North African Berbers were originally black as well. And that for number two, the term Moor was actually used as a synonym for a black person at one point in time. And it was because, the term Moor literally meant a black person, okay, back during like the 15th and 16th century, if I'm not mistaken, during Shakespeare's time period, right? Shakespeare used the term Moor oftentimes to describe various characters in his plays, like Othello. He described Othello as a quote unquote Moor, and of course Othello, for those of you who haven't read or who don't know about that play Othello that Shakespeare wrote, the character of Othello was a so-called black nobleman. Okay, I believe he was a knight as well. But yes, Othello was a black person. And then you even have another character, another lesser-known character than Othello, named Aaron the Moor. Okay, but those are going to be characters that I reference in probably my next video series on the black characters of Shakespearean plays. So that should be something that you guys should look out for. Okay, but anyway, but the Moors, those were so-called black people. Spaniards, Italians are more swarthy than the French. So now I even referenced the Spaniards and then the Italians in my previous series, once again on the Black Vikings, when I cited Benjamin Franklin's account of what a lot of the people who lived out in Europe looked like. And he described a lot of the people out in Europe as being swarthy as well as tawny, right? When he was talking about the swarthy Germans, he called the Germans quote unquote swarthy, but he also called various other peoples of Europe swarthy as well, or dark complexioned as well. So like he referenced the Spaniards and the Italians in that conglomerate of who he was calling quote unquote swarthy or tawny. Once again, I'm gonna expound on that even more in later videos. So now let's read another example of what the term swarthy means according to the Noah Webster dictionary. Okay, so now their swarthy host would darken all our plains. So now as we can see, black as the swarthy African. So now once again, the term swarthy back during this time period primarily meant, maybe not exclusively meant, but primarily meant somebody who was quote unquote black, like an African, as it says down here, black as the swarthy African. That's the example. That's the only example that Mr. Noah Webster gives of what the term swarthy meant back during this time period. Once again, this dictionary was written in 1828. So back during 1828, and then even what we just read, the 1882 dictionary, the term swarthy primarily meant a black person. And then when we go back even further, I'm sure we can imagine just how much the term swarthy, or even this term up here, swart, was used to reference a so-called black person, right? Because remember, on the etymology.com dictionary definition of the term swart, let me go back to it. Right? In this sentence right here, it literally says the true Germanic word surviving in the continental languages but displaced in English by black. So once again, and then it says of skin color of persons, late 14th century, so the late 1300s. So during that time period, and even further on, the term swarthy, swart, which is just basically swarthy, it was like what we would call today black when referencing somebody's skin complexion, right? Or even, unfortunately, a lot of people associate the term black with an ethnicity, and the black really isn't an ethnicity. It really isn't. But that may be controversial for some people to hear. But no, being so-called black, that is not an ethnicity. There's no other black civilization, quote unquote black civilization, across the world that identifies themselves as being so-called black. Not even the Africans. Okay, but that's going to be another story for another day. But the term black, when used, oftentimes was used as a term for to describe somebody's physical characteristics, right? So if somebody had dark skin, you call them black, right? Or even back then, like as this says right here, as this sentence right here, if somebody had very, very dark skin, you would call them a quote unquote swart, right? Or you refer to them as a swarthy person, right? So that's primarily what that word meant back, like I said, during the medieval time period, as this states right here, 14th century, that's around the medieval time period, and even on down to the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, as we just saw. Okay, so that's what the term swarthy meant, you guys. Alright, so now that we're done with our investigation of what the term swarthy means, or what the term swarthy meant, and why it was applied to Vlad Dracula, obviously the term swarthy in the physical description that we just read about Vlad and what Vlad looked like, that term swarthy was applied to him because he was a so-called black person, or a so-called black man. Okay, as we just saw, the term swarthy, or even swart, during the late 14th century, which is like the late 1300s, that was a term that was the equivalent of what we would say today, or how we would describe somebody today who fits this physical description of being a so-called black person. That term swart was basically the equivalent of what we would say today, quote unquote black, to describe somebody that we would deem as being a quote unquote African American, or a so-called black person. Okay, so Vlad lived during the not the 14th century, but he lived very, very shortly after, or he was born very, very shortly after the 14th century, the late 14th century, which is where that term swart was said to have meant something similar to what we would call today, quote unquote black, when describing somebody. So Vlad lived around that time period where the term swarthy or swart meant primarily a so-called black person. Okay, so, but just to even further validate, or to put even more veracity to the notion that Vlad was in fact a so-called black person, let's just go about investigating his ancestry, and even people of his house, of the royal house that he descended from, that being the house of Basarab. Let's go about seeing what the ancestry of even his royal house of Basarab was, or who the ancestors of the royal house of Basarab were. Okay, so now, just to give a brief background on the quote-unquote house of Basarab. So obviously the house of Basarab was founded by a man by the name of Basarab the First. If I'm not mistaken, I believe I mentioned him in my informational portion of this video series, but Basarab the First was the founder of the royal house of Basarab in Wallachia, and I believe he was the very first independent ruler of Wallachia. He was the man who liberated the Wallachians from the Hungarian crown. So at one point in time, the Hungarians had most of the provinces of Romania, if I'm not mistaken, under their control. And even into Vlad's time period, when the when the province of Wallachia was liberated from the Hungarians, you still had certain Romanian provinces like Transylvania that were still vassal states, or subsidiary states to Hungary. But Basarab the First, or Basarab the Founder as he was called, was the one who liberated Wallachia from the Hungarian crown. So he became the first independent ruler of Wallachia. Okay, so, but now I just want to take a look at the royal house of Basarab's family tree real quick to see who Basarab the First, who came before Basarab the First. So as we can see here on their royal family tree, on the family tree of Basarab, of the house of Basarab, we can see Basarab right here, of course, at the very top. But above him is a man by the name of Radu Negru Voda. Now, for those of you who don't know who this character is right here, or who this person is right here, Radu Negru Voda is regarded as the founder of Wallachia. So he was the founder of the province that Vlad, as well as the people who came before Vlad, like Basarab the First, he was the founder of that Romanian province of Wallachia, according to Romanian legend. Okay, and he was also, according to Romanian legend, I believe he was also regarded as the father of Basarab the First. Okay, or at least that's who he's associated with, as being the father of Basarab the First. So Radu Negru Voda, as we can see here, he has this little moniker here after his name, Radu, as Negru Voda. Now we're going to do an investigation into this word, or this moniker right here, Negru Voda, and particularly we're going to look at this term right here, Negru. All right, we're going to do a somewhat brief investigation into what the term Negru means. All right, so but now let's just read a little bit about Mr. Radu Negru. All right, so I'm going to start from right about here. So the Cantacuzino Chronicle reported that in the year 1290, a leader called Radu the Black, all right, so Radu the Black, who controlled the small Transylvanian lands of Fagaras and Almas, had crossed the Carpathian Mountains to Kipalung and Arges, where he had begun to make a new country. Contemporary sources did not confirm either the occurrence of such an event or the existence of Radu the Black. So, of course, they're trying to discredit the existence of Radu the Black, but Radu the Black was a real person. It's just they don't know necessarily whether or not he was an individual person that was actually named Radu Negru or Radu the Black, or whether or not he was associated with other legendary Romanian figures in Romanian history, but we're going to go over that in a minute. But as we can see here, Radu was known as Radu the Black. All right, states right here, and it states right there that Radu was known as Radu the Black. So now, obviously, he was given this name, the Black, or this moniker of the Black, due to him having that moniker in his name of Negru. Let me go back real quick. Oops. All right. All right, so as we can see here, he has the term Negru, or this word Negru right here. So this is what gave him that moniker of being called Radu the Black. Okay, so that was another name for Radu Negru. And for those of you who haven't figured it out by now, the word Negru just means black. But once again, we're going to go about investigating exactly the what the origins of this term Negru is and how it relates to even other words that mean something similar. But the term Negru was the reason why Mr. Radu Negru, or Radu the Black, was given that moniker of the Black. Okay, and now let's see another name that was applied to him as well. Let me see here. So now I'm going to start from right about here. So in addition to these specific references to the Black Prince, whom Xenophon identified with Radu the Black of the Cantacuzino Chronicle, Xenophon used what he called indirect proofs to support his theory that Wallachia had been founded by Radu the Black. So once again, we can see here that another moniker was applied to Mr. Radu Negru, and that moniker that was applied to him was the Black Prince. All right, so just going back to his name of Radu Negru Voda. Let me go back to that. So this is what this part of that moniker of the Black Prince is in reference to. Oops, let me see. Okay, here it is. So this is the part that it was in reference to. So it says Negru Voda. Okay, so Negru Voda is where you get the moniker of the Black Prince from. All right, and we're going to see in a minute why he was referred to as the quote-unquote Black Prince. But let's read one more thing about Mr. Radu Negru. So as we can see here, Radu Negru. So once again, we see the moniker of Negru Voda, or the Black Voivode, or the Black Prince. All right, so once again, he was referred to as Negru Voda because the term Negru, of course, as I already stated, meant black. Then of course, Voida means voivode or prince or what have you. So then we also see Radu Negru, or Radu the Black. So let's just do an investigation into why exactly Mr. Radu Negru was called these two monikers of Radu the Black, or excuse me, the Black Prince and Radu the Black. Let's go about seeing what the term Negru means exactly. Alright, so now let's look at this definition here of the term Negru. So Negru, surname, user submission. The meaning of the name is black. It comes from Negru or Nero, which means black in Latin-based languages. So as we can see here, once again, the term Negru is a name that quite literally means black. All right, so that was the reason why Radu was referred to as Radu the Black, or Radu the Black Prince. Okay, because this name, or this word Negru means black. And as we can see, it comes from Negru or Nero. So just as an aside, for those of you who are remotely aware of Roman history, of ancient Roman history, you'll be relatively familiar with this word Nero right here. Okay, so the term, or excuse me, the Roman, I believe he was a Roman emperor, Nero, I believe he ruled Rome in either the 1st or the 2nd century AD. That ruler Nero, or that Roman emperor Nero, had that name applied to him. The name of Nero applied to him because that was a name that implied skin color. Okay, the word Nero implied skin color and was basically the same word as various other names that were applied to people back then in the Roman Empire that were meant to imply skin color. So the word Nero, as we can see here, is being juxtaposed to negru, which as we see here means black. So the name Nero, or the word Nero, is a word that means so-called black. Okay, and once again, that was a practice that the Romans conducted back then, naming themselves after what they called, I believe, I forget the term. I forget the exact term, but they were terms, or they were words that were used to describe somebody's complexion based off of their name. Okay, so the name Nero, or the Roman Emperor Nero, was called Nero because he was most likely a so-called black person, but that's going to be another story for another day. So, but let's just move on and see yet another definition of the term negru. So as we can see on wordsense.com, we have negru. Right, so negru, alternative forms neger or negru, origin and history from Latin negrum, accusative of niger. So once again, I referenced this term niger in my previous series on the Vikings, on the quote unquote Black Vikings, which once again you guys should go and check out. And I did a very extensive investigation into this term niger, and what this term niger means, and what other words that derive from this word niger mean. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, the word niger is a Latin term that basically just means black, just like negru. Okay, so niger is the forefather word of words like negro. Right, of course, the word negro, that word was a term that was applied to so-called black people. Right, the Spanish and the Portuguese, if I'm not mistaken, referred to an African tribe known as the Bantu peoples as Negroes. And that's where you get that term Negro from. Okay, so the term Negro is a term that primarily meant, well, really exclusively meant a so-called black person, even up until I want to say the 40s or the 50s, and even into the 60s, black people were referred to commonly as Negroes. Okay, so the word Negro comes from niger. It comes from the Latin word niger, and other words that are usually meant to imply somebody who is a so-called black person also derive from this term niger as well. Even the more offensive version, or the more offensive form of this word niger, that being the N word, right? The N word that has two G's instead of one G. Even that word derives from niger. Okay, but once again, that's something that you guys can go and check out in my Black Vikings series. Okay, I go into a very, very extensive investigation into that term niger. All right, so but just to relate this term back to negru, so the word niger is basically the same root word, or it's basically the same origin word as negru, as it is for negro as well. In other words, that mean, once again, somebody who's a so-called black person. So basically, negru is a very, very similar word to negro, and they both have very, very similar connotations and definitions behind them. Okay, so negru and negro, those are two names that basically mean a so-called black person, but just in different languages. Okay. So let's read down a little bit. Austrian, negru, Austrian. So same thing. From Latin, nigrum, accusative of niger, adjective, black. Right, so when describing somebody who's a quote-unquote negru, when you apply that name to them, it just means a so-called black person. Right, so here's the Romanian definition of negru. So from Latin, nigrum, accusative of niger, same thing. Adjective, black. All right, so when describing somebody, once again, when describing somebody, the term negru means a black person. And you know what? It even states down here, negru, plural negri, noun negru, a black person. All right. So once again, this term negru is basically the same. It's basically the same as calling somebody a quote unquote negro. Right? When you call somebody a negro, you're usually referring to a so-called black person. All right? So this is what this term negru means. So I think it's pretty obvious, or at least it should be pretty obvious, why that name was applied to Mr. Radu Negru. And we're going to see a little bit later even scholars have attested to that term negru, or that moniker of negru, being applied to him because he had quote unquote dark skin complexion, very, very dark skin complexion. Okay, and as we just read here, he was in fact called Radu Negru, or Radu the Black, because negru is a term that's in reference to a quote unquote black person, which is most likely what Mr. Radu Negru, or Radu Negru Voda, or Radu the Black Prince was. He was a black person. Okay, and once again, he was an ancestor of Mr. Vlad the Impaler. Not just Vlad the Impaler, but he was an ancestor of all of the royal voivodes or princes of Wallachia. So Basarab the First, or Basarab the Elder, or not Basarab the Elder, but Basarab the Founder, Mircea the Elder, right? Mircea the Elder, a very, very legendary Romanian ruler who ruled Romania, I believe, not Romania, but he ruled Wallachia for almost 30 years, if I'm not mistaken. He presided over the largest rulership, and I believe one of the longest tenures in Wallachian history, right? So men like those men, and of course Vlad the Impaler's father, Vlad Dracula II, men like those people were derived from Mr. Radu Negru, all right, or Radu the Black. So their ancestry goes back to Radu the Black, and as we're finding out here, he had that name applied to him, or that moniker applied to him, because he was a so-called black person, as this states right here. The term negru, when applied to a person, is usually in reference to a quote-unquote black person. Okay, and that's true even today amongst the Romanians. That term negru, when applied to somebody, it's usually meant to entail that they're a quote-unquote black person, but we're going to see that in a minute. All right, so now I just want to look at the word, or the term negro, real quick, just to even further accentuate that the term negru does in fact mean somebody who is quote-unquote black, or of quote-unquote African American or African ancestry, whatever you want to call it. And by doing that, I just want to look at a term that I referenced was similar to the word negru, which of course is negro. So now let's just read real quick what the term negro is. And I know people are or should be relatively familiar with the term negro, but I just want to look at this real quick just to, like I said, further emphasize and accentuate that the term negru was in fact a word that was used to reference a so-called black person. So let's look at this term negro, which I've already established is a similar word to negru. So now let's look at this. Dated often offensive, a person of black African ancestry. Dated often offensive, a member of a group of people formerly considered to constitute a race. See race. So of course we know it's the so-called African race of humans having African ancestry and classified according to physical traits such as dark skin pigmentation. Okay, so when we go down to the etymology, we see Spanish or Portuguese from negro, black, from Latin negro or niger. So once again, negro, negru, those two words derive from the same exact fount. They both derive from quote unquote niger. Okay, so negro and negru, those two words mean the same exact thing. It's just their origins are in different languages. So of course, as it states here, the term negro originated in the Spanish or Portuguese language, and as we just read, negru, of course, was a Romanian word, or primarily a Romanian slash I think Austrian word as well. So they derive from different languages, but they pretty much have the same root term that they both derive from, that being this word right here, niger, the Latin word niger, which once again just means black, okay, or somebody who has a so-called black or dark complexion. Okay, so and now I just want to prove real quick that when the term niger was applied to somebody, it was mainly meant to entail that person had quote unquote dark skin complexion, or that person was a quote unquote what we would call a quote unquote black person. All right, so now I just want to read this little excerpt here from a book that is going to give us an idea of what the term niger means, or how the term niger was applied to somebody who had a certain skin complexion. So now let's just read this highlighted portion right here. All right, let's start from right about here. So I shall only remark here upon the name Duff, that as Niger and Rufus were names of families amongst the Romans from the color and complexion of men, so it seems Duff was from the swarthy and the black color of their of the tribe. Okay, so once again, as we can see here, Niger, which is a word that once again just means black, was a word that, going all the way back to the ancient Romans, was meant to entail somebody who had dark or black skin color, or dark or black skin complexion. Okay, so the term niger does in fact mean a black person, or somebody who has a quote unquote black complexion. Okay, and just once again going back to what I referenced earlier with the Roman Emperor Nero, the word Nero derives from this word niger as well. So once again, as I stated, the term Nero was applied to that Roman emperor because he was most likely a so-called black person. Okay, because as it states here, the Romans would apply names, or what they call color names, to one another. So if you saw a Roman citizen that was called Niger, or the Niger, or even Rufus, which I believe is just another way of saying somebody who's ruddy or reddish brown. Whenever you heard somebody being called Niger or Rufus, that was in reference to their or that was meant to be an allusion to their skin complexion. Okay. So the term Niger was a term that was used to describe somebody who we would call today quote unquote black. All right, so I just wanted to prove that real quick. So, but now I want to go to a story that happened relatively recently. So now I'm going to go to a modern example of how that term negru is applied to people today. So, but the situation that I'm referencing is a situation that happened, I believe, last year, that was relatively controversial, and it had to do with a soccer or a football referee calling a so-called black coach the term negru. All right, so now I just want to look at this story real quick here. It was a relatively controversial story that happened, as it states right here, March 8th of last year, 2021. And this is a situation having to do with a Romanian soccer referee who, as it states in this heading right here, was banned for an entire season for calling a so-called black coach, a so-called black soccer coach, the term negru. All right, so now let's just read this article right here. So, a Romanian soccer referee was suspended for the season after making inappropriate comments about a black coach at a Champions League game. UEFA ruled on Monday. Paris Saint-Germain, Istanbul, Başakşehir refused to continue playing on December 8th because players believe fourth official Sebastian Coltescu racially insulted the Turkish club's assistant coach Pierre Wibo. So now let's look and see why these people were so incensed at what this referee called this so-called black coach. So a UEFA investigation led to Coltescu facing the lesser charge of inappropriate behavior for using the Romanian word for black negru to identify Wibo. Okay, so obviously, as we can see, this referee got in trouble for calling this so-called black referee negru. Or excuse me, this so-called black coach negru. So this shows right here that even down to today, the term negru is a word that, when applied to somebody, is meant to entail that person is a quote-unquote black person, as we can see right here. This most likely, obviously, is the coach, this so-called black man right here. Who's looking mad, looking like he wants to fight him. That's the so-called coach, or the so-called black coach who we call negru, right? So once again, that term negru, or this is just meant to prove that this term negru is a term that primarily means a so-called black person. Okay, so this just even further bolsters my statement about why Mr. Radu Negru was called Negru, or had that moniker applied to him of Negru, right? So now let's go about looking at a few translators on the internet who state that the term negru also means somebody who is a so-called black person. Okay, so now let's just read this. So this is Quora. It's an online forum named Quora. So now the question is, why calling somebody negru in Romanian is racism, since Romania does not share the same historical background as the English-speaking countries. This is referred to as the PSG Istanbul Başakşehir match. So now let's see what a few of these people who state that they're Romanian have to say about the term negru. So this is the best example of misinterpreted political correctness. The Romanian referee is an idiot because he should have avoided using the word negru. The guy is not racist. The referee team have spoken in Romanian, not in English. That is clear. So 99.9999999% of the Romanians use the word negru for designing or designating skin color and the African race. All right, the word negru with U is differentially pronounced from the infamous English word. Right, so so that's true because they both derive from different languages. So I'm just going to keep reading what this person has to say. In Romanian language, the word negru is not insulting. We have different words for insults. So obviously, this person must be of Romanian descent, quote unquote Romanian descent, because he refers to, he says we, so he must be talking about him and other so-called Romanians as well, along with himself, have quote unquote different words for insults. But according to him, according to this dude, he says 99.99999% of Romanians use the word negru for skin color, right? Designating somebody of the quote unquote African race. So of course we know that that means that, that usually generally means somebody who's so-called black, who we would call today quote unquote black. They'll usually try and group all so-called black people under that designation of being quote unquote African. But that's with the assumption that all so-called black people derive from the west coast of Africa, right? And were brought over here as so-called slaves from that small little island off the west coast of Africa. That's usually what that's meant to imply. But what this channel really is meant to accentuate is that Africa is not our only place of history or even of origin. Okay? So-called black people are aboriginal or indigenous to most of the world, to be honest with you. Not just so-called Africa. So grouping people who are designated as being quote-unquote black under the designation of being quote-unquote African, that's not correct. Okay? That's not correct. But I'm going to be talking about that all throughout my channel's existence, because that's very, very important for our people to understand that no, we're not all descended from so-called Africa. Okay? Or quote-unquote Africans per se. But just going back to what this person stated, so even he states, or even he admits, that so-called negru, where the word negru is in reference to an African or a so-called black person. All right. So now I want to go to one more internet forum. So now we're on Reddit. So now let's read what some of these people on Reddit have to say about the term negru. So under this person's name, he has native. So I'm guessing that means that he's a native of Romania, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure if that's exactly what that means, but let's read what this person has to say. So basically, the question that was asked is the same exact question that was asked on Quora. So let's read what this has to say. So the truth is, it's not a racial slur. If you look in Dacian online, which is the official website for the Romanian dictionary, negru refers to people who belong to the negroid black race. Negru also means the color black. It is not like the N word in English, even though it sounds similar. Well, they both are similar because they both derive from the same root word, as I already stated all throughout this video. Negru, negro, even the N word, right, with the double G, those all derive from the same exact word, and they all mean the same exact thing, that being black, or when applied to somebody who is quote unquote so-called black, right, somebody who has what we would call African American ancestry. All right. So, but according to this person, negru means somebody who was of the negroid / black race. So again, why was that term applied to Mr. Radu Negru, who eventually became, of course, the founder of Wallachia? Why would that term be applied to Mr. Radu Negru if he was anything other than a so-called black person or a black man, right? The so-called Black Prince, or the Black or Radu the Black, right? Those were two of his main monikers, Radu the Black or Radu the Black Prince. It's obvious, or at least it should be obvious now, that the term negru was applied to him because he was in fact a black person. All right, let's read other comments. So negru means black in Romanian, as in the color black. It is not used much as a slur. We don't have a history of interacting with black people. Are you sure about that? Are you sure about that? What's this person's name? Evil Bunny. Are you sure about that? I don't know. It is not. It just means black person. All right. So once again, negru, black person. All right. It just means a black person. That's all the term negru means. When applied to a person, it means a black person. So it should be made obvious that the term negru was applied to Mr. Radu the Black, or Radu the Black Prince, because he was a quote-unquote black person, a so-called black person, as we would call today, or as we would say today. All right. So now let's look at something else here. So now we're just going to continue on our investigation into Mr. Radu Negru, but let's go about looking at a person that oftentimes is associated with Radu Negru, because as I stated earlier, Radu Negru was a relatively mythical figure. He's a sort of semi-mythical figure. He's like a kind of like sort of like a folk tale to a degree. Kind of sort of like Mr. Vlad the Impaler. Vlad the Impaler has been kind of reduced to a folk tale, even though he was in fact a real person. That's obvious that he was a real person, but he's been kind of I wouldn't say he's been dimmed down to just being a mythical figure, because of course he is the inspiration for the fictional character known as Count Dracula, right? So he has that attached to him, but of course he was a real person, just like Mr. Radu Negru was most likely a real person. Well, not most likely, he was a real person. It's just most of these scholars, so-called scholars, most likely don't want to admit that he was a real person, because once again, when one does real research into the origins of these people, right, like Mr. Radu Negru, one can find out what their true origins are and why certain names like Negru were applied to them, right? So Radu Negru, as I already stated, and as I've already been able to prove, or at least as I believe I've been able to prove, was a black person. He was a black man. Okay, that's why he had that term Negru applied to him. So, but there have been other figures in history that Mr. Radu Negru have been associated with. And so let's just look at what one of those people, or who one of those people was. So now let's start from right about here. So, due to a lack of any actual contemporary evidence, the Roman historian Nicolae Iorga doubted the existence of such a voivode, considering that Negru Voda is simply a nickname that could have been given to Basarab I, the real founder of Wallachia. So even if this term Negru Voda was in fact given to Basarab I, we can kind of sort of get an idea of why it was given to Basarab I. Once again, the term Negru, when applied to somebody, means a black person. So if it was given to Basarab I, it most likely was given to him. That moniker of Negru Voda, or Black Prince, was most likely given to him because he was a so-called black man. But let's keep reading. So other view is represented by Niago Dejwarva, who identifies Negru Voda with Thoko Miris. So Thoko Miris, as it states right here, was Basarab's father, or at least he's one of the people who is regarded as being Basarab's father. So a lot of scholars will allege that they're not sure if Radu Negru is this person right here, Thoko Miris, or if Radu Negru was an actual real person separate from Thoko Miris, or even Basarab himself. But we're just going to take a look at real quick what or who Thoko Miris was in a little bit, but let's keep reading. So explaining his nickname by his alleged Cuman descent, he appeared to have a dark skin color for the Romanians. Wow, you don't say. Yeah, I bet he did have a dark skin color for the Romanians. Shoot, Radu Negru probably looked like Bernie Mac, to be honest with you, seriously, because as we've already seen, Negru is a term that just means a black person, right? So it's obvious that Radu Negru most likely was, as I've already stated, a black person. But you know what? Let's just do an investigation on this term, or on this person, Thocomiris, real quick. So Thocomiris, also Tihomir, was the father of Basarab, who would become the first independent voivode of Wallachia. Many Romanian historians, such as Vlad, Georgescu, and Marcel Popa, believe that Thocomiris was a voivode of Wallachia who succeeded Barbat. So now let's look at Thocomiris' predecessor, Barbat, real quick. So Barbat was the brother and successor of Voivode, the Tovoi, whose territory had comprised northern Oltenia or Romania. So now let's look at this man Latovi real quick, and I'm going somewhere with this. So let's just keep going. So Latovoi was a Vlach/Romanian voivode in the 13th century, whose territory comprised northern Oltenia in today's Romania. So I just want to take a look real quick at this term Vlach, because this term Vlach is going to tell us a lot about not only the ancestry of Vlad, and not even only the ancestor of Vlad's royal house, the house of Basarab, but this is going to give us an idea of the ancestry of the Romanians, the Aboriginal Romanians in general. Okay, so now let's just look at this term Vlach real quick. So Vlach, also Wallachian, and many other variants, is a historical term, an exonym used from the Middle Ages until the modern era to designate many Romanians, but also Aromanians and all those other people. So, but once again, this term Vlach is going to be the operative term that we're going to look at real quick. So the term Vlach, as it states right here, is just another word for a quote-unquote Wallachian. Okay, so there are various theories as to where the quote-unquote Wallachians, or the people known as quote-unquote Vlachs, come from. There are various theories, but the two main theories that are usually deemed as being the most likely are that the quote-unquote Vlachs, or the Wallachians, descended from a group of people known as the Dacians. Okay, that's one of the main theories that people usually associate the Vlachs with being descended from. Alright, so now I just want to do a brief investigation into who the quote-unquote Dacians were. So now let's read this little description of the Dacians real quick. So the Dacians were a tribal people with a society at least superficially similar to that of the contemporary Gauls and Germans. We know from Roman writings that there were two castes in Dacian society. The upper class wore caps, long beards, and medium-length hair, while the lower class, made up predominantly of farmers, went bareheaded with long hair and less facial hair. A man of the cap-wearing caste, unless he was a priest, probably devoted most of his time to war. Factors like his birth, merit, and connections would determine whether he became a war chief, like the Kabbalists, serving as an officer in the kingdom's army, or whether he fought simply as an elite warrior in the battle line. The fact that Dacian priests are known to have used both bows and arrows and spears in rituals would suggest that they were able and perhaps expected to fight alongside the laymen in Dacian society. The average Dacian warrior was just that, a warrior, by no means a professional soldier, probably a farmer, hunter, or miner. By trade, he was obligated to take up the spear when the local clan leader was preparing for a raid or preparing to muster his contingent for service in Depopulation's army. So now let's read real quick how this person, who is this Salab? So according to him, he is a historian from Maryland. So let's read what this quote-unquote historian from Maryland has to say about the appearance of the Dacians. So Dacians were said by contemporary writers to have been similar to the Germans and the Celts in physical features: tall, fair-skinned, and blue-eyed. So for number one, let me just go over this real quick. So the Germans, he compares the Germans and the Celts to the quote-unquote Dacians, and he basically states that the Germans and the Celts had the same physical characteristics as the Dacians, and of course he describes them as being tall, fair-skinned, blue-eyed, etc. The same narrative that gets pushed all the time about a lot of the ancient civilizations. But let me just go through this real quick. So for number one, the Germans. Once again, if you guys watch my Black Vikings series, I go over very, very diligently the origins of the Aboriginal Germans, that being the quote-unquote Germanic tribes, and I conducted an investigation as to what exactly they looked like, and in one of the articles that I showed, it was of I believe it was an independent scientist who was able to prove that the Germans, the Aboriginal or the ancient Germans, did not have fair skin and blue eyes. Okay. I forget what the woman's name was, but once again, you guys can go and you can check that out. That's that Black Viking series out, where I was able to prove that the Germans were not, in fact, quote unquote, fair skinned and blue eyed. Okay, or at least not the Aboriginal Germans, and then even up to Benjamin Franklin's time, right? Because Benjamin Franklin described the Germans as being quote unquote swarthy, and we just did a rather extensive investigation into the definition of what swarthy means, right? Swarthy means, or at least it meant, a quote unquote black person, or at least primarily a black person. Okay, so the Aboriginal Germans and even the latter Germans, they were not fair skinned, or at least the bulk of them were not fair skinned. Okay, so the Germans and then the Celts. Now the Celts are going to be a group of people that I'm going to delve into to a very, very large extent, because they're a very important ethnic group for our people to understand, for our people to understand that we descend from. But the Celts were not, once again, fair-skinned, blue-eyed. They were what we would call today, quote unquote, black people. All right, the Celts are the Aboriginal settlers of a lot of places in Europe, right? Particularly the British Isles, or places like England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales. Okay, so the Celts were not, they were not so-called fair-skinned. They were not quote unquote Caucasian. All right. So, but let's go about seeing real quick another description of the Dacians, made by a historian or scholar, made by scholars that preceded this person up here, Salah, who claims to be a so-called historian. So let's look and see a description of a Dacian. So let's see. So I'm gonna start from right about here. So losing their name. They were originally Getae. These people did not lose their national greatness, having attacked Greece with some success. They were not afraid to try their hand at Rome, and they succeeded so far as to make it a question whether Rome should be Dacian or Dacio Rome. In the time of Trajan, the question was settled in the latter sense, and after a series of attacks conducted with all the strength of the empire, in the time of its greatness, the country was conquered and occupied. So a fine, swarthy, black-haired, and handsome race were these Dacians. So now, just going back to what that so-called historian stated about the Dacians being a fair-skinned and blue-eyed race, and I believe, let me go back to it, I believe he described their hair color as being red. Right, so he says tall, fair-skinned, blue-eyed, intending to have red hair. Right, so he describes them as being fair-skinned, blue-eyed, and having red hair. But this person states that they were swarthy and black-haired. All right, so once again, we know what the term swarthy meant back during this time period. If you guys can see in the corner, this book was written in 1863. So remember the book that I referenced, not the book, but the dictionary that I referenced earlier on, that was written in 1882, that outright stated that the term swarthy really just mainly meant somebody who was quote unquote dark brown or very, very dark skinned. And then it even gave an example, a primary example of an African. right? As to imply that the term swarthy was primarily applied to people who were quote unquote African, or who could be deemed as quote unquote African. So this person describing the Dacians as being swarthy, I think we should know what that means, right? So this is oftentimes what happens. You'll have so-called historians of the modern day who try and paint a certain narrative about what a certain group of ancient people looked like, right? They're all, for the most part, either blonde or red-haired or have quote-unquote fine hair, right? And they're obviously fair-skinned, right, with blue eyes. That's how a lot of historians describe like the ancient Greeks today, and then of course even the ancient Romans, right? They describe them as being a quote unquote fair race, right? So, but that's basically them just trying to paint the narrative that the ancient world was mainly quote unquote Caucasian, or was mainly comprised of so-called Caucasians, but that's not true at all whatsoever. All you have to do is just look at writings from ancient sources like Herodotus, a man by the name of Herodotus, who's regarded as the father of history, the quote-unquote father of history, who describes people like the ancient Egyptians, and even a group known as the Colchians, who is another group that I'm going to be speaking about. They're another very, very important ethnic group for our people to understand that we descend from. But the Aboriginal Egyptians, and I'm saying the Aboriginal Egyptians, not a lot of the so-called Egyptians that a lot of people state are the Aboriginal Egyptians, but the actual Aboriginal Egyptians and the Colchians were described by Herodotus as being quote-unquote dark-skinned with woolly hair. Now, for those of you who don't know what woolly hair means, woolly hair is just basically another word for quote-unquote Afro-textured hair, or what so-called black people would call nappy hair, right? So Herodotus literally described the ancient Egyptians as well as the Colchians, and the Colchians, if I'm not mistaken, derived from the country that we know today as Georgia. Okay, not the Georgia of out here, but the country known as Georgia, near I think the Caucasus region, right? But he described both of those ethnic groups as being quote unquote dark skinned with woolly hair. And believe it or not, that's how the vast majority of people in the ancient world looked like. They were quote unquote black, as we would say today, or swarthy or dark skinned, right? They were so-called black people. Most of the ancient people of the ancient time period were black people. Most of the ancient Greeks, they were so-called black. The Romans as well, or the Aboriginal settlers of Italy, they were so-called black people. All right, but once again, that's going to be something that I mention all throughout my channel's existence. But just getting back to the Dacians, as this person describes them, were swarthy with black hair, not fair skinned with red hair, but swarthy or dark skinned with black hair. All right, so now let's read one more description of the Dacians. I'm going to start from right about here. So the Hungarian of the lower classes is a very different looking person from the Wallachian. If from the villages in the mountains we pass to the so-called military frontier, a borderland in which every male capable of bearing arms is a trained soldier, living under military discipline and governed by martial law, we shall at once perceive a difference. The villages are better and more regularly built. The men are smarter, the women neater, and the children do not seem to have cultivated quite such close intimacy with the little pigs. The dress also is different, and the women begin to show a tendency to color and personal ornament, which in Wallachia hardly seems to extend beyond the fringe of the aprons already described. So now let's see how this person describes the Hungarians and the quote-unquote Dacian. So the Hungarian is hardly less swarthy than the descendants of the Dacians. All right. So once again, this author describes the Hungarians as being swarthy. along with the Dacians. All right, so once again, the Dacians were not, as that person described them, being quote unquote fair skinned. They were not fair skinned at all whatsoever. They were, as these two book references that I pulled up described, they were swarthy. The Dacians were swarthy. All right, and that would make sense because a lot of the people that we just read about, from Radu Negru all the way down to Vlad the Impaler, who of course is the main person who we're trying to trace their ancestry back to, right? So that we can prove what Vlad the Impaler actually looked like, or what Vlad Dracula actually looked like. But even down to them, they were both described as being quote unquote swarthy or even dark skinned. Okay, so the Dacians being swarthy or dark skinned will make a whole lot of sense. Especially since the people who they descended, or who they were the ancestors of, were also described as being dark skinned. Okay, so, but as we can see here, it says the Hungarian is hardly less swarthy than the descendants of the Dacians. So now let's just see real quick if the Hungarian was in fact quote unquote swarthy from another source. So another name for the Hungarians is the Magyars, or the Magyars, if I'm not mistaken. So the Hungarians are another group of people that I'm going to be talking about definitely, but for now let's just see real quick from another source that the Hungarians were in fact quote unquote swarthy. So under the fostering care of this preacher of Pan-Slavism, the numbers of the society rose from a dozen to close on 70, mainly Slavic peoples at the gymnasium. A small Slav library was formed, and in 1840 a small book was published under the name of Getrenica, I don't know what that says, but containing what were regarded as the most promising literary efforts of its members. More than one youth had yet to learn to ride when he mounted the fiery Slav Pegasus. The trampled rights of the Slav nation might be defended. A loathsome raven, doubtless the swarthy Magyar of the Asian steppes, tries to force the golden nightingale to crow. So once again, another name for the Hungarians were the Magyars. Okay, and as we can see here, they're described as being swarthy. All right, so the Hungarian was a quote-unquote swarthy person, or most of the Aboriginal Hungarians, they were in fact swarthy. And as that other book that I referenced stated, the Hungarians were no more or no less swarthy than the Dacians. Okay, so both the Dacians and the Hungarians were in fact so-called black people, or swarthy, dark-skinned people. All right, so just going back to the theory that I referenced earlier about the Vlachs or the Vlachs or the Wallachians being descended from the Dacians, being one of the main theories that often gets pushed about what their origins were. I believe that's probably the most widely accepted theory that gets pushed about who the descendants of who the ancestors of the Romanians are, that being the Dacians. If they were in fact descended from the Dacians, I think we can put to bed or put to rest, just based off of the little research that we did on the Dacians, as well as the extensive research that we did on Vlad, as well as his ancestor Radu Negru. Right, we can kind of come to the conclusion that if they were in fact descended from the Dacians, and the Dacians were described as well as being quote unquote swarthy or dark skinned, at least according to other historical sources besides what we first read, that stated that they were fair skinned and red haired, which is of course incorrect, as we've been able to prove. So if they were in fact descended from the Dacians, that only bolsters my statement that the Romanians were in fact black, and that the descendants of the Dacians, right, that being the Wallachians and other Romanian tribes or Romanian ethnic groups, they were also so-called black. The Aboriginal Romanians, they were so-called black. All right, so and also Vlad the Impaler, being a descendant of the Dacians as well, he was also so-called black, or he would be also described as being so-called black. All right, so that's that theory. So another theory that oftentimes gets pushed about the quote-unquote Wallachians and who they descend from has to do with the original name of the Wallachians, that being the Vlachs or the Vlachs, being from Welsh descent, or being of Welsh descent. Okay, so the name, or the word Vlach is a Welsh word. It was a term that was applied to the Wallachians, if I'm not mistaken, or the Vlachs, by the Serbians, and I believe it means a Welsh person or a Welshman. But let's go about looking at that real quick. So now we're back on etymology.com. So Vlach, so a member of a Latin-speaking race of the Balkans, a Wallachian or Romanian from Bulgaria, Vlach or Serbian, Vla from Old Church Slavonic, Vlaku, a Slavic adaptation of Germanic, Wall, source of Old German well, foreigner, especially applied to Celts and Latins. See Welsh. Okay, so once again, as it states here, the Slavs applied this term Vlach or Vlach to the Celts and the Latins, and primarily the Celtic tribe that they applied that term to, of Vlach or foreigner to, was the Welsh contingent of the Celts. Okay, so the Vlachs or the Vlachs, that means Welsh, right, or a quote-unquote Welshman. But let's go about looking. All right, so now let's look at another definition of the term Vlach or Vlach. So now on Wiktionary it says, from Proto-Slavic, speaker of a Romance language, from Proto-Germanic, Welas, non-Germanic, foreigner, Celt, later Roman. Right, so once again, a Celt or a quote-unquote Welshman, presumably introduced into Slavic around the 7th century, but first recorded only in the 11th century in Byzantine Greek, and English used as a synonym of Wallachian from the 19th century. The word is etymologically distantly related to Wales, Welsh, Walloon, and Gaul. Okay, so of course it states right here, once again, the Welsh are the people of Wales. All right, so the Slavs oftentimes will refer to the quote unquote Welsh as this term Vlach right here. All right, so the Welsh were the main Celtic tribe who would be associated with this term Vlach, as it was originally applied to them. Okay, and then of course it states a Walloon. So a Walloon is basically somebody who was an inhabitant of Belgium, of the country of Belgium, and then also of some parts of France as well. Okay, so this is what this term Vlach was primarily used to denote, according to the Slavs, was a so-called Celt, or somebody who spoke the Roman language as well. Okay, so the Vlachs or the Vlachs, just going back to the ancestry search that we did on Vlad and then even on Basarab. When we looked at Basarab's alleged father Thocomirus, I was able to trace Thocomirus back to a person who was referred to as a Vlach, one of the the ancestors of Thocomirus, or the father of Basarab, was referred to as a Vlach or a Wallachian. Okay, so that term Vlach was another word to describe a quote unquote Wallachian. So the ancestors of Vlad the Impaler and then even of Basarab possibly could have been, according to what the definition of this term Vlach is and who it was applied to, it is a possibility that the Vlachs even were, or the Wallachians even were descended from the Welsh, or the people of Wales, the Aboriginal people of Wales. Okay, so now let's go about looking at what the Aboriginal Welsh looked like. Okay, what the Aboriginal Welsh really looked like. And once again, this is going to be part of my Celtic series that I do way later on down the line. I'm going to go over diligently over each British tribe, right, or each Celtic tribe that inhabited the British Isles, right. Once again, the Scots, or the people of Scotland, Ireland, Wales, England, right. I'm going to be, and then even other people as well, as it states right here, the Gauls, right. So the Gauls, they inhabited, I believe, Switzerland, France, Belgium, I believe certain parts of the Czech Republic, and then even Germany, right. So they were a quote unquote Celtic tribe as well. So I'm going to be going over all of those people when I do my Celtic video, but let's just do a brief investigation into what the Welsh look like, just to bring this home. So let's see here. So I'm going to start from right about here. So there can be little doubt that all the west of England and the south of Wales, if not more, land toward the interior should be regarded as Siluria. Though the classical writers knew the Silures in that region, they had no knowledge of the Cymry or the Welsh. So Cymry was like another word for an ancient Welshman or an ancient Welsh person. So, but I just want to reference this word right here. So this word Sulur is in reference to a tribe, an ancient tribe, a relatively ancient tribe of quote unquote Welshmen that derived from, I believe, southeastern Wales, more specifically southeastern Wales. And they're important because they're said to be the group of people that the character known in mythology as well as in history, King Arthur, was descended from. Okay, so King Arthur was said to have descended from the Sulures, and the Sulures, once again, were a Welsh tribe, and they were always uniformly described as being quote unquote swarthy or dark, but that's going to be another video for another day. But let's just keep reading about the Welsh. So the natural conclusion is that the Silurians or Iberians, right? So the Iberians are the Aborigines of Spain and Portugal, or they were the one of the first settlers of Spain and Portugal. And once again, I'll be talking about them in later videos, but I'll even reference them a little bit later in this video. So now, represented by the little dark Welshmen, are the oldest existing race in Wales, and though now speaking Cymraeg, were long before the Cymry there. Okay, so of course, once again, it states here that the Aboriginal Welshmen were quote unquote dark Welshmen or little dark Welshmen. Okay, so and what's important to remember here is that it states these little dark Welshmen descended from or were related to the Iberians, right? Because right here it says the natural conclusion is that the Sulures or Iberians, now represented by the little dark Welshmen. So that means basically that the Iberians eventually metastasized into the quote unquote little dark Welshmen. All right. So the Welsh are related to the Iberians. So just remember that real quick, but I'm going to just keep reading a little bit further. So Professor Boyd Dawkins puts the case very clearly, saying, at the present time, you have merely to go into the marketplace of Saint Asaph and Dinabig, and you will see small, dark Welshmen with black eyes and hair, contrasting in every point with our ordinary ideas of Welshmen. So now, what is this person trying to say here? What is this person trying to say here? So, obviously, today, when we think of people from Wales, we think of so-called Caucasians that, are very, very pale, right? Of course, there are some so-called Caucasians that have, darker complexion in Wales as well, but most of Wales is comprised of so-called Caucasians or quote-unquote white people today. But according to this person right here, he's stating that the original Welsh looked very, very different from the Welsh or the Welshmen that existed even back during his time period, because Obviously, during this time period, the so-called Caucasian had comprised most of the population of Wales and then most of Europe in general as well by this time period. And I believe that states 1881. So, of course, this time period, the so-called Caucasian was regarded as being the main inhabitant of Europe. But according to this person, once again, he states that the Aborigines of Wales look very different from the Caucasians of his day, right? Or the Welshmen of his day, I should say. So, let's read. All right, so now we're back on the Welshmen. So now let's read this little excerpt right here about the Aboriginal Welsh. So the small dark Welsh, the Welsh, as their name implies, are simply the inhabitants of Britain, strangers to the English invaders. It would be absurd to expect that the rude warriors who pushed the inhabitants of Roman Britain before them to the west into Wales, Cumbria and West Wales, Devon and Cornwall, would have drawn any subtle ethnological distinctions to the destroyers of the Roman Empire. Their foes in Britain were Brit Welsh and in Gaul Welsh or Gal Welsh, under which heads were included without any distinction the races with which they conquered. It is clear, however, from the pages of Caesar and Tacitus that at the time of the Roman conquest there were at least two distinct peoples in Britain: the tall, fair-haired, blue-eyed Celt, identical with the Gallic tribes, and the dark-complexioned, wavy-haired South Welshmen or Sulors, who are compared by Tacitus to the Iberi of Spain. So, once again, the Welsh are described as being quote-unquote dark-complexioned or dark-skinned. Okay? So they're described as being dark-skinned, and they're juxtaposed with the Sulors, right, of southeastern Wales. So, but once again, as I stated earlier, for you guys to remember, the Welsh are related to the Iberians, all right, or the Aboriginal Welsh are related to the Iberians of Spain and Portugal. Okay, so that's going to be important to remember. So now let's move on real quick. So I'm gonna read started from here. So much then for the evidence from histology and history as to the arrival of the Welsh people within their present boundaries. One section of them, the small, dark people, are still to be found living amongst us. But in these days of railroads, when the Welsh people have such a habit of going to America and coming to the great cities in this country, accumulating fame and reputation and proving themselves to be cosmopolitan, the genuine stay-at-home Welshman is a very rare animal. Consequently, the small dark race in Wales is rapidly being crossed out. So what this is basically acknowledging is that the Aborigines of Wales, and not only of Wales, but during a certain time period around like the late 1700s, and then of course going into the 1800s as well, a lot of the Aboriginal people of Europe were being excommunicated out of Europe, or they were being casted out of Europe. Okay? And once again, as I've stated over and over again, the Aborigines of most of the known world during the ancient times, and then even on down to the medieval times, and then even on down to relatively recent times. And when I say relatively recent times, I'm talking about like the 16th, 17th, and even into the 1800s to a degree. The people who mainly inhabited Europe and other places around the world were so-called black. Okay? So most of the inhabitants of places like Wales, of countries like Wales, they were so-called black, but they were eventually conquered and then casted out of Europe and other places that they inhabited as well, but mainly Europe. So as it states here, once again, the small dark race in Wales is rapidly being quote-unquote crossed out, meaning they were being exterminated. Okay, they were being cast out, they were being bred out, or they were being killed. That's usually what would happen to the Aborigines, the so-called black Aborigines of Europe. They would be casted out, or they would be bred out through, I believe, killing the males, and then the usurpers and I think we can guess who those people are. But the usurpers, copulating with the Aboriginal women of that region, and producing more predominantly looking, what we would call, quote unquote, Caucasian looking children with those Aboriginal women of that area. So they would breed out a lot of the Aboriginal peoples of Europe as well, and then they would just outright either kill them or sell them into slavery. Right? They would kick them out and then sell them into slavery. I believe a lot of the Aboriginal people of Ireland were kicked out of Ireland. It was either Ireland or England, but a lot of the Aborigines of Ireland and England were kicked out and sold into slavery into, I believe, Australia during the 1800s, during like the mid to late 1800s. So a lot of that was going on back then. So that's one of the main reasons why a lot of the so-called Aboriginal black populations of Europe no longer are in Europe now, because they were, as this states right here, being crossed out. All right, they were being crossed out. Okay, but once again, that's going to be something that I reference in later videos. Most likely on the Celts, when I do my video series on the Celts. But just one more thing, a lot of so-called black people in this country have Welsh last names. All right, like Williams, Jones, Griffin, Hughes, James. All those last names, those are Welsh last names, and those are not slave names. Those are not names that our people received from slave masters. Okay, as I've kind of sort of proven in this video, the Welsh, the Aboriginal Welsh, they were so-called dark or black people. Okay, so a lot of our people get our names from our Aboriginal ancestors that resided in Wales and that descended from Wales, but that were just kicked out from their home country to a lot of the places that we would call today the Americas, and then even near the Caribbean as well. A lot of the black Aborigines of Europe were kicked out into the Caribbean as well and were sold into slavery into the Caribbean lands. Okay, but that's going to be another story for another day. But just reading on, so indeed, during my own experience in the last 20 years, I have noticed a most marked diminution in the number of small, dark Welsh people, undoubtedly of Iberic stock. So once again, he's acknowledging that there is a diminishing of the population, the Aboriginal population of Wales, who were, as he states, small and dark, right, or so-called black people. And he states here that they were related to or of quote-unquote Iberic stock. Okay, once again, the Iberians, they were people of, they were the people who established the Iberian Peninsula in Spain and Portugal, in between Spain and Portugal. And they went on to become the settlers of various other islands in Britain, like Ireland, if I'm not mistaken, was first settled by the Iberians. Ireland, for those of you who don't know, was originally called Hibernia, right? And that name was given to that country or that landmass by the Iberians. Okay, so the Aboriginal Iberians, they were so-called black, as we're about to see in a minute. But the Welsh, they descended from the Iberians. They were very, very heavily related to the Iberians. So let's just read a little bit more. So I say Iberic stock because supposing you were to compare one of these small dark Welshmen with a small Basque speaking from the Pyrenees. So the Basques were a group of people from, I believe, northwestern Spain, if I'm not mistaken. So the Basques were of quote unquote Iberic stock is what this person is saying. So a small dark Highlander. So the Highlanders were people from Scotland. Okay, the Aboriginal Scots from Scotland, they were what we regarded as quote unquote Highlanders. I believe they were pirates, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so but they were, as this states right here, so-called dark or black. They were black people, the Highlanders from Scotland, and a small dark south of Ireland man. So once again, the Irish, the Aboriginal Irish, they were also so-called black as well. Okay. So let's just go about proving real quick what I stated earlier about the Iberians, just to bring this all to a culmination. Okay, so now let's go about investigating the Iberians real quick. All right, so this is going to conclude our investigation into the Aborigines of Wales, and particularly how they relate to the people who I've been referencing all along throughout this entire investigation of the Welsh, that being the Iberians. Now let's read this entry from this book, The Riddles of Prehistoric Times. So, the Iberians in ancient times inhabited the western and southern part of Europe, the northern part of Africa. In fact, all parts reach from the Mediterranean Sea. The Basques in Spain and the Basques in Spain and France, the little dark Welshmen, the Scotch, the black Celts to the west of the Shannon River in Ireland, as well as the same kind of men in Brittany and Aquitaine in France, the Guanches of the Canary Islands, and the Berbers in Africa are all probably the remnants of the race, or they're all the remnants of the same race, basically, is what this person is saying. So once again, as we've seen, the Welsh are related to the Iberians. Okay, so the Welsh and the Iberians, they're both pretty much the same ethnic group of people. So now let's just read a little description here of the Iberians and what the Iberians looked like. Okay, so this is going to come from Ancient and Modern Britons, and once again, this is a book that I referenced in my Black Viking series that a lot of you guys should go out and get if you want to have a better understanding of so-called Black history in Europe. Okay, so but let's read what Mr. David McRitchie, who's the author of this book, has to say about the Iberians. So the Iberians are styled swarthy and curly-haired. The word swarthy is rather elastic, for although literally swarts, yet it is taken, I fancy, to mean something not quite so dark as the color of a negro, and its usual exception. So of course we know that that's not true, because we just read what the term swarthy was mainly in reference to. It's primarily in reference to, or at least it was primarily in reference to, a so-called black person. But let's keep reading what he has to say. So perhaps this distinction does not exist, but at any rate, if the small dark Highlander and the black Celt to the west of the Shannon be assumed to be the descendants of Iberians, it may fairly be urged that with so much intermixture with fairer races during the last 2,000 years, the stock must now be lighter skinned than then, and as representatives of the first century must have been actually as black as Negroes. So once again, this person, David McRitchie, he's stating the same things that I've been stating throughout this entire series, or at least throughout this entire investigation on the Welsh. That being that the original inhabitants of Europe were originally dark or black as Negroes, as this person states right here. All right. Even he states that during the first century, the Aborigines of a lot of these lands that he mentioned that were inhabited by the Iberians, or that was settled by the Iberians, and even the descendants of the Iberians were as black as Negroes. Okay, so now let's just keep reading. So as a matter of fact, Pliny characterizes their complexion as Ethiopian, that is, as black as an Ethiopian. And it may be that the curliness of their hair was of the same nature as a Negro's as well. So what is this person trying to say here? It's obvious that what they're saying here is that the people of the Iberic stock, or the people who are related to the Iberians, were in fact so-called black people. Because as he states right here, he cites Pliny, who was a Roman historian. Pliny the Elder, if I'm not mistaken, was a Roman historian. He cites Pliny stating that the Iberians were Ethiopian, or as black as an Ethiopian. And this term Ethiopium, I'm gonna address that term as well in later videos, but that term Ethiopium was one of the many words that the Romans would use to describe a black person, along with other words like fuscus and niger, right? We already investigated what the term niger meant, or what niger means, what it originally meant, that being a so-called black person. So this term Ethiopium is in the same category as words like that, okay, that the Romans would use to describe people of color. So if Pliny is describing the Iberians as being quote-unquote Ethiopium, or as black as an Ethiopian, and also their hair being of the same texture as the so-called Negroes as well, then what can one presume, or what conclusion could one come to other than that the Aborigines of Europe, or the descendants of the Iberians, were in fact people of color? They were so-called black people, right? So once again, this just further substantiates what I've been saying. So just going back to the Vlachs, or the Vlachs, who I stated are possibly descendants of the Aboriginal Welsh, due to their name quite literally being applied to them to denote them being quote-unquote Welsh or Welshmen. That is yet another indication that the ancestor, or the ancestry of Vlad the Impaler, if they were in fact Welsh, they were so-called black. And that would align very, very well with the description, the physical description of Radu Negru, or Radu the Black Prince, who was given that name obviously because he was a so-called black man, or a negro, or a negro per se, right? And that would also align with the description, the physical description that I gave of Vlad the Impaler being so-called swarthy, and also having quote-unquote braided hair, right? So that right there is gonna be our the end of our investigation on Mr. Vlad the Impaler and his origins. So now we should have a pretty good idea of what Mr. Vlad the Impaler truly looked like, okay? Vlad the Impaler was a so-called black man.